Brian talked about the moral uh, dimension of some of these trade-offs. And this diagram from the UN General Comment 1914 on the right to health was part of a report from the Economic and Social Council, which reviewed Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which has been ratified, signed and ratified by 157 countries of the 193 UN member states, but not by the United States. Jimmy Carter signed it, but the Senate has never ratified. But it captures some of the moral dilemma problem that Brian alluded to, and that is if we implement the right to health, then for some of the things that have to be made available, as Stan talked about, contraception and abortion, availability, acceptability, accessibility, and quality are all essential components of the right to health. The late Ossie Davis, who was a great civil rights champion, the actor, some of you probably have seen films that he acted in, and in his later years he became a great human rights activist. He was once asked to define human rights, and he said, "My right to be me must never interfere with your right to be you." And I think that that's the moral framework around which we need to grapple with some of these challenges about family size, about population, about immigration, about consumption. Because if we had the same sense, the communitarian sense, that my right to be me shouldn't somehow destroy the environmental sustainability for all the rest of you to be you. And I think that that's incumbent as we get into the difficult discussions about creating incentives for limiting family size. 10 years ago, when Stan and I organized the first Population and Environment Symposium, when this used to be the East Wing Auditorium, Stan invited John Bongartz down, a Hopkins alumnus who was with the Population Council. At that point, he said in 1998 or 99, the International Fertility Survey, there were over 100 million couples in the world who wanted to limit family size but did not have access to contraception. Still true. So it's still probably even larger. So we can do some things that don't in any way, should not in any way inflame those on the extreme right, those who want to bury their hands in the heads in the sand about population. But it's a difficult message to craft and get out there. So now our panel is here, and we're looking for your ideas about resolving this. Yes? Stuart has the first solution.
On the notion of the only sensible growth rate is zero, population growth rate is zero. For a little over 400 years ago, some English ships came to Jamestown, and I understand that Chief Powhatan got together with his sub-chiefs, and they said, well, you know, Chief, the only sensible growth rate here is zero, so we're going to just send these people back. I mean, I think that kind of statement has to be put in the context of where you are in history and cultures and development status and all kinds of things, kind of first point. Next point is there's a lot of tension that's been expressed about the whole relationship between what causes impacts. And some people are aware, but I think a really simple and very helpful thing to think of is this identity developed by Paul Ehrlich, the population bomb person, and John Holdren, one of our nation's great scientists, currently Obama's science advisor in the White House, and that's the identity that I equals PAT, impacts equal population times a level of affluence times a level of technology. And it's all three of those things, not just, there isn't one that's underlying everything, They all three underline everything. They all work together. So if we're talking about how to make the biggest differences in reducing impacts, carbon emissions, whatever, NOx emissions, fertilizer going into the bay, it's a combination of those things, but most fundamentally, it's how we live. It's not how many of us. What I've heard about here in this whole session about population pressures on the bay are chicken population pressures on the bay, not people population pressures. If we live different, all the kinds of things that Dr. Schwartz was talking about, our impacts would be much less. So we need to be thinking about all three of those things. So none of them is the underlying one that overrules all the others or is the only one. There's all three. And these days, we can make huge improvements in reducing impacts by particularly working on the technology one, which is, for instance, how much energy per GDP we use, the energy intensity of the economy, or the carbon intensity of the energy we use. Those are the biggest ways that we can lower impacts these days.
So, Stuart's suggesting that the entry, the talking point that Brad in Environment Maryland ought to use is stay away from the messy stuff of population or how much can we consume, but let's talk about technology improving the efficiency with which we consume. Do you buy that, Brad?
Well, I think it's an excellent point. I'd like to think we can do all of the above, right, to some extent. In terms of, once again, the near-term bang for the buck, how are you going to clean up the Chesapeake Bay? It's the chicken population problem. And it's true that the Purdue Corporation is selling frozen chickens overseas and leaving the waste in the Chesapeake Bay. And that's a big problem that we should fix. I think that the biggest single thing we can do right now is, as part of the new Chesapeake Bay restoration plan, stop the over-application of manure on farmland in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Right now, farmers lay it on thick, it washes off in the rain, and it goes in the bay. There's too much of it, and it's a terrible system that allows farmers to over-apply manure. We have the opportunity to change that. Governor O'Malley just put that change in the new draft plan for the Chesapeake Bay restoration. It needs a lot of follow-up and to add the details to really make that happen. And you better bet that Purdue is using every political lever it can to get that provision stripped out of the Bay Restoration Plan. I think it's winnable, though. And if everybody's going to drop everything and work on one thing, that would be my pick right now because it would make a big impact and it's very winnable. I'd like to think, though, that we don't have to drop absolutely everything, and hopefully we can work on other issues as well. And that's why I'm just intrigued by this discussion and trying to explore the possibility. Can we also work on population, family planning, those issues? Again, I don't think it's going to come from a citizen-based organization, but some other type of organization could lead the effort, and it's worth discussing.
So, Brad, Brian showed that 50% of the water flowing into the bay is from the central Pennsylvania hog CAFO capital of the eastern United States, except for North Carolina. Should we not simultaneously be going after that?
Absolutely. Dairy farms in Pennsylvania are a huge part of the problem.
Okay.
And basic protections like fences along the streams can make a big difference.
And Tom, you seem to be making a pretty persuasive case for the fact that indeed human population, the sort of the cement umbrella that's spreading over the watershed.
Well, I think, even certainly if you look at what we can do and need to do in the next few years to decade to clean up the chickens and the dairy cattle, it doesn't have much to do with limiting population. But big picture, we're going to raise more chickens to feed a growing world, fewer chickens to feed a shrinking population. There's one other point you made. I'm very skeptical that technology's energy efficiency is a case in point. In a growth economy, ever use less energy. I think they can slow the rate at which energy use grows. But what happens is if you're in a growth economy, you get more efficient. The money you save is invested in more economic growth. There's also, it's a little bit like when the supermarket comes out with your favorite chocolate chip cookie, half the fat, half the calories, you buy twice as many. We do that. And the bottom line is despite substantial gains in energy efficiency since the Arab oil embargo in the 70s, we continue. We've only slightly slowed the rate at which we use energy, the rate of growth. So I'm very skeptical of technological solutions.
Energy use
and
in this country has been...
I don't mean that you don't do them. I just mean that you lower your expectations for what they're going to get you.
Energy use in this country has been basically stable for about the last 5 or 6 years, and actually down the most from
the last couple
ever.
of years is not a very good. Yeah, I mean, let's yeah.
And
Brian,
per
do you wanna
capita
comment on
energy
that?
use peaked in the 70s in this country. It's much lower than it is now.
Yeah, but how about energy use?
I said per capita energy use.
Yeah, but how about energy used?
Same thing as I said a moment ago.
Well, I think the point, Stuart, that Tom is coming back to is per capita doesn't tell the story.
Yeah, I can adopt 10 children and tell you that my family now occupies very little space per capita. You know, but
yeah. Okay, I'm blinded, so way in the back.
Got one back here.
Okay.
Thanks for all your thoughts today. A couple of things have been abundantly clear to me. One is in the last 11,000 years we have, and especially in the last 200 years, we have forgotten how to act as nature. We are inextricably interlinked with all that's going on around us, and we have forgotten how to be that. And so as we're rounding up all the chicken shit and delivering it back to Purdue headquarters, who is working on how we can start to positively participate again with the Bay? How do we become the place that we are? And there's a reason that the Elk Ridge is called the Elk Ridge. And part of that is because the native people actually burned the undergrowth in the forest regularly to clear it, to encourage grasses. And by doing that, they actually increase the productivity of that ecosystem. So just leaving nature to do what nature does might not be, there might be more that we could be doing. So besides maybe the Baltimore Ecosystem Survey, like, is there anyone working on what else can we do that's positive and not just less bad?
Well, you know, Wendell Berry, a farmer and essayist, environmental essayist, boils it down to support your friends, not your enemies. What he's talking about is buy your produce locally, buy your products locally to the extent you can. Encourage local production. There's a big vision for New England forests out of Harvard that's gaining a lot of traction up there, which actually calls for vastly increased timbering on New England's forests, which in Massachusetts right now could support 40% of Massachusetts timber needs on a sustainable basis, but only support 6%. And the authors of this, you know, they're talking about very sustainable forestry, but they're talking about getting people back in touch with New England. Their thesis is that using these forests harder, if you will, than they are now, will actually create more of an ethic to keep them in forests over the long term. So, you know, I think that's one small way you start is you know, support your friends.
Yes, Mark?
Yes. You know, it's a tautology that the health of the planet, the ecology of the planet depends on the actions of each of every one of us and every person on the planet. So what do you think of the idea of something like having a Friendster site where the ecological impact of every single person is evaluated, and most of the information is public. How far do you live from your job? What square foot size house do you live in with how many people? How many children do you have? Then the rest of the world can use this information as they see fit. Maybe a foundation could provide below market mortgage rates for the young people here. Maybe if somebody wants to date you, you look at his profile and see what kind of character he has. Maybe you'd have a lottery, make him eligible. Maybe Comcast would be willing to give free TV. I don't know.
I can start right now. My former friend Tom Friedman at the New York Times lives in an 11,000 square foot house in the D.C. suburbs. So, okay.
So, Brian, what do you think of tracking consumption patterns and naming and shaming in an open way?
As somebody who learned the hard way that the city just put these cameras out here on Monument that got me going through the red light, not the red light, going 36 miles an hour. I feel that, don't forget that the main opposition that environmentalists get is that we're trying to tell people too much how to live. And I don't know that I want to violate people's privacy.
Well, I think you'd have to emphasize the positive. In other words, you might bury these 11,000-foot house people somewhere else. But the positive, this man, somebody I know in the audience, rides his bike to work, and he's not a 30-year-old, so he would get extra credit. He would have more lottery. So emphasize the positive.
I would say, go for it.
Okay. Yes, over here.
Along that line, what about the possibility of taking a lot of these things that are vicious cycles like manure coming down the Susquehanna, and then having chicken poop coming from the eastern shore, and creating like virtuous cycles, but like using the chicken poop as fertilizer upstream, and this sort of thing, like commodifying things that are just right now considered waste, would seem like a win-win situation.
So in the watershed up in Pennsylvania, a lot of the farms are trying to use the manure for methane power, and some of that's happening. I don't think we have the right incentives, the right tax structure, the right energy prices to incentivize that.
No, I think almost everyone agrees now, Pennsylvania and Maryland and probably Virginia, that we have to some extent find alternative uses for the manure. Shipping it is pretty prohibitive if you're going to use it as fertilizer. I mean, there's plenty of land in the Bay watershed that could absorb more manure, but just shipping it there, unless you were willing to just subsidize that. We subsidize sewage treatment or have somebody subsidize it. But
Tom, can I push you on that a bit?
Yes.
One of the, you quoted Wendell Berry, and Wendell Berry was sort of picked up the legacy of Aldo Leopold, and Aldo Leopold's concept of ecologic agriculture emphasized trying to keep things within the same ecosystem. And so part of the problem is that we're moving a lot of nitrogen from the Midwest to these coastal areas as feed. So how would you go about dealing with the enormous amount of feed that the swine capos in Pennsylvania and the chicken industry on the Delmarva Peninsula?
Well, yeah, you're right. I mean, we're importing nutrients from all around the country. We can't grow enough grain for all those chickens in Maryland to import it from Iowa, which can actually deliver it to Salisbury, Maryland, cheaper than you can grow it in Salisbury. Iowa's just so productive of corn, and also doesn't have to pay for polluting the Gulf of Mexico with their runoff. But if those concentrations of manure we have now remain approximately the same, we have to do something. There was a company several years ago wanted to build a power plant in Dorchester County, Maryland, that would have immediately taken half of all the chicken litter on the Delmarva Peninsula. In fact, they wanted a contract guaranteeing that much. It looked like a pretty good deal. For a lot of reasons, the Glendening administration didn't go for it. they built that plant in Minnesota, burning turkey wastes. It's been operating for several years. I'm told they're beginning to build them in North Carolina. It's certainly a viable technology. It would create some air pollution, but I don't think it was very much. But I mean, that may not be the solution, but I think we have to go to some things like that, and preferably ones that could take a pretty big chunk.
Mm-hmm.
Or I guess you could just say make Purdue responsible for it, and then capitalism will find a solution. I don't know.
You have to get the technology right. That plant in Minnesota has had some pretty serious air pollution issues. And then there's one waste to energy facility getting built now in Princess Anne on the Eastern Shore, but it's going to create energy out of chicken manure, but it's not going to get rid of the nitrogen and phosphorus. You're still left with the same problem, and they won't have a very good marketable product to really get it out of the watershed. There are other technologies where you can wind up with lightweight and separated phosphorus and nitrogen, which would be very useful and marketable and a good way to get rid of those nutrients and create electricity at the same time. It's more expensive. So I'd love to see some pilot projects on that and go forward and have some of that happen, but both things need to happen. There are so many chickens right now. There's an excess of manure. We need to do something with it. It's just a practical problem. We're not going to get rid of all those chickens overnight. At the same time, we gradually do want to move towards a more sustainable agricultural system. We have the whole population of the eastern seaboard right in our backyard, and we're growing soybeans for chickens to export. That makes no sense. So we need to grow food for people who live near here. But again, that's not going to happen overnight, so we should do both.
A technology that separates nitrogen and phosphorus in manure would be nice, because right now, if you're a farmer and you put on enough manure to supply your crops nitrogen, you've automatically put on 3, 4, 5 times as much phosphorus, and you can't do a thing about that. So separating the nutrients is a critical thing.
We have time for 2 more questions. This gentleman here.
I was afraid this conference would be an example of preaching to the choir. I was afraid that no one would come to a population conference who was not already convinced of the need to do something about population. Now my dismay is the opposite. Even the most outspoken people who came to this conference don't want to talk about population as something we need to take action on, and I don't know why. Professor Schwartz, in arguing why we should talk about consumption and not instead of in preference to population, or in priority versus population, said people don't like to be asked to sacrifice. And he was talking about consumption, and he was talking about having fewer children. Well, I don't understand that. Asking people to consume less is asking them to sacrifice. And that's what he wants to ask people to do. I don't understand why asking people to have fewer children is asking them for a sacrifice. I had no children, and I certainly don't feel that I sacrificed much. I wish someone could help me understand why people refuse to talk about population, and why people regard fewer children as a sacrifice.
I'm very interested in whether you think that we can get to the same point by kind of talking more about the need to look at alternatives to economic growth. I mean, ultimately, I think that brings you to a stable population. Do you feel that that might be a way to go? Talking, I mean, my view of the population thing in this country right now, because such a large proportion is immigration. That seems to me to be at the key of the marketing problem, if you will, and maybe more than marketing. I don't mean to dismiss that. I don't deal with these matters, and I'm constantly reminded there's little things like my use of illegal, probably should say, you know, people are very sensitive. This whole area of immigration is very loaded, you know, undocumented, illegal. They have different connotations to people. So I think that's why it's difficult to have more of a conversation right now, or one of the big reasons.
So, Brian, do you want to have a rebuttal? And then we probably are going to have to, is it real quick, short? Okay, why don't you ask it, and then we're going to give Brian and Stan a chance to wrap up, and we'll conclude a minute or two over time.
Okay, great. Thank you all so much. This has been great. Really quick, I want to say, if you haven't read it yet, the incredible ecologist H.T. Odom, he gave me a pre-copy of his book before he died, A Prosperous Way Down. It's an interesting perspective. It was his last book that he ever wrote, how to decelerate our economy and our society to a more sustainable way. But in terms of population, I know it's maybe something crazy, but have you ever thought about watershed residency permits? And then really quickly, I think you get a lot of better play with positive feedbacks, and I liked what was said about, you know, maybe there is some kind of incentive for folks who have one or no children as a positive way to encourage that kind of thing.
Brian, and then Stan.
I'm sorry, your name was Stan? Cliff. Cliff, in all of our work here in the Program on Global Sustainability and Health, we acknowledge that population and the impact of populations are equal problems. I just personally have a problem with the notion that you know, the average American is using 5 times more bioproductive land surface than the average person living on this planet, and it just feels, number one. Number two, the folks who have the biggest footprint on this in this country are the rich folks, and the people having the kids are the poor folks. And it just feels wrong to me to tell the poor folks to stop having kids while we're living like pigs. And I just have a problem with that. And then in terms of immigration, this country was founded, you know, with this notion that you're allowed to come here and seek a better life. And it just feels wrong to me that when we're living so profligately, to build walls that are bigger so nobody else gets to live like us, it feels wrong again. And so, to me, it's not that I don't acknowledge that population is part of the problem. It clearly is. It's what do you want to talk about first, and what arguments can you make? And Bob and Stan acknowledged that at the start of this that we wanted to have a debate. So I'm here to just give the other perspective, because it's not fun to just have everybody agree. But it just doesn't feel quite right to me to talk about population before you talk about average personal consumption. And it's not consumption, it's this whole notion of how much land and water and energy each American uses to do what they do. It's too much. And it doesn't matter. You could cut population in Maryland now. You have to cut the ecological footprint also. You just got to.
I agree, of course.
Stan.
Okay, 2 quick things. First, to respond to Brian a little bit, we don't have to talk to people about having fewer children. We can put incentives, and as I said, half of pregnancies in this country are unintended. We can work on that. We can work on 1 million abortions each year. We can work on this unintended pregnancy, making contraception accessible to people who need it. The last thing I want to say, somebody commented about the zero growth. Yes, maybe I forgot to mention, that's in the long term. In the short term, we can have positive and negative. We live on a finite planet. In the long term, the only sustainable population growth rate is 0. Thank you.
Great. I have a quick, short list of thank yous. First, to our 4 panelists. It's been terrific to have them come and share their expertise with us. And then Rebecca Klein, who is gone. Darlene Jackson in the back, who worked with Becca to make all the arrangements. Chris Stevens, our communication director, who got the word out and helped with all the slides. Mia Salucci. Mia Salucci and Brent Kim, who passed the mics around, and Sarah Rodman, who gave all of you these lovely programs. So some of you have to run. Some of you want to ask questions of the speakers who can stay for a few more minutes. Please come forward, and thank you all very much for being here today.
Good seeing you.